right, everybody, thank you so much for joining this Experience Makers Tech Academy session. My name is Joshua Young. I am the Content and Workfront Market Lead for Western Europe here at Adobe. And joining me is Timo Linen. He's a solution consultant. He is located in our Nordic region. He focuses on Adobe Experience Manager. He's going to speak up in a few minutes and provide a demo. But we're going to talk about managing headless experiences with Adobe Experience Manager today. And I'm going to start with a few things to begin with. And one of the things I want to kind of touch on at first is this concept of composability, because headless CMS and headless in general is often coupled with the concept of a composable architecture. And a composable architecture provides solutions that can be assembled in various combinations to satisfy specific user requirements. And I think an important point to this is specific user requirements. And that's critical to make sure that whatever technology you're using to satisfy your needs are tied to user requirements. And that's where, in a lot of cases, headless may be the right solution in order to satisfy that requirement. And headless is where the management and delivery of content is decoupled from the presentation. So in a headless scenario, you're providing data rather than structured HTML in a presented way. And so it's pretty interesting to think about this and touch on these topics, because what headless can do is basically help address this explosion of innovative experience types that are happening in the market now. As content experiences and expectations have evolved, there's so many different types of digital channels that we engage with as consumers. And we also are different types of consumers as well. And we need to be able to personalize that content. So the need to address all the different emerging technologies, as well as address the needs of personalized consumers, makes this a pretty complex thing to handle. And headless is, of course, one of the solutions to be able to help with that emerging need, with so many new channels hitting the market pretty rapidly today. But I like to look back at kind of the evolution of a marketing journey and a maturity that a company is going to go through to think about why this is critical. And we started off, focusing mostly on desktop and mobile solutions. And then it wasn't about a ton of different channels, and headless wasn't really a component in that strategy. But then as we started to integrate marketing stacks, other parts of the marketing stack together, being able to use information about a person to drive a personalized experience for them, or needing to integrate commerce and content together. This started to develop a need to have a very quick to market solution in order to be able to get that content and that data and make it available however it gets delivered to a customer. And that's when you move into this true omni-channel world of being able to not just look at desktop and mobile, but being able to deliver content to IoT devices, being able to speak to my car and get information back relevant to me, as an example. And that moves into this last phase, which I call anything is possible, which is where we are now, where to me it feels like it's endless, the amount of possibilities that we can develop and create in order to engage with customers. And headless is a big driver for that anything is possible mode. But what's also important is knowing that headless is it's an enabler. And I like to think about where are future digital experiences born? It's not in data and kind of that last edge of data that touches a consumer. It's in the creative process and being able to ideate around what are the next generation experiences? What are the things that we need to create in order to engage emotionally with our customers? And Adobe has a ton of insight around that because of our creative tools that are often used to basically create what the future experiences will be. And I think that Adobe's in a very unique position, being able to leverage the insight and everything that we gain from the creative process that we're very involved in as a company, and using that to drive our strategy around how we want to deliver and engage with customers at the final touch point, which is a combination of headless and also headful experiences, which is more of a traditional look. So this all leads to some guiding principles and expectations for a composable world. Speed to market, durable and dependability, flexible architecture, innovative playground. These are 4 top things, and Timu is going to touch on these, especially the architecture and the innovative playground that we've already talked about, being able to use something like Headless to iterate around new channels and new ideas, but also scalability and being cloud native and reusability of content and being able to have teams collaborate well. These are all a part of the composable world, but also guiding principles in what we build at Adobe and what we provide as part of our solutions. And I want to touch on 2 really, really quickly. One is speed to market. And I think it's really important to recognize that, we invest a lot in making sure that our customers, when they invest in an Adobe solution, they can leverage the benefits from that as quickly as possible. But there's also ongoing iterations and ongoing development that happens. And narrowing the gap from coming up with a feature and developing it and being able to push it live is super important. Speeding up that innovation by removing dependencies and maintenance for product release cycles is part of what we've evolved in with our cloud solution offering, and something that we're addressing very seriously. And then lastly, having teams collaborate well is super important. When you think about producing content for all these different channels, for all these different types of personas, well, everybody across an organization are now content contributors, and helping in the creative process and having transparency, allowing the teams to collaborate, is very important. And one of the things that we're focusing on through our work collaboration tools like Workfront. Now with that, I'm going to turn this over to Timu and let him jump in and actually show you a demo of how this stuff works actually in action with AEM. Timu?
Thanks, Joshua. So let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Timo Leinen. I'm a solutions consultant with Adobe. I'm based in Stockholm, Sweden. And my role within Adobe has me working with our customers on their strategies around content and asset management. So let's start by looking at why we should care about our headless content strategy. So really, and Joshua touched upon this as well, right? So our customers expect us to deliver a relevant, personalized experience, no matter where and on which device they are currently consuming our content. And this is nothing new. I mean, you've heard this before, right? There are so many devices, applications that we need to push our content to in order for our customers to consume it. And that number of devices and channels and services that will only increase in the future. So for us as a business, this poses a challenge from a content perspective. So how do we push the right content to the right channels in a scalable way that not only works well for our content creators, but also for our developers and IT departments developing applications for our different services. So before we look at how we achieve headless content delivery with Adobe Experience Manager, let's just have a look at a use case. So as you probably know, Adobe's Creative Cloud business is huge, and we have millions of customers using our products on different devices. So behind me, you can see 3 different channels: the Creative Cloud desktop app, our adobe.com website, and our mobile Creative Cloud app. And on each of those touch points, I'm consuming the same piece of content. In this case, a tutorial on when to use RAW versus JPEG. And you'll notice that the content being served is the same. It's the same content on each channel. The only thing that differs here is how each channel surfaces and displays that piece of content. So we achieve this by using Adobe Experience Manager, creating the content once in the form of a reusable content fragment. And this allows me to define the structure of the content and have my different applications then consume that content and display it in the best way for that specific channel. Now, this also means that my developers can work on those channels independently of my authors who are creating the content. So in this example, you can see that my content being displayed in the mobile app can be divided up in a couple of different sections. So we have a title, an image, a rich text multi-line field, and we can then query our web content management system, AEM, to give me those pieces of content in the right format, language, variation, etc. that works for that specific. Now, just to give you some numbers, I spoke earlier about achieving scalability when it comes to content delivery. And we at Adobe are doing this at scale with AEM, Adobe Experience Manager, with over 10,000 pieces of content in different languages, delivered to 40 different services. and requesting that content more than 400 million times a week. And during our events like Adobe Max that we had a while back, we have even higher loads, right? So now that we've looked at an example, let's just dive in how this actually works with Adobe Experience Manager and how AEM can help us achieve what we just saw. So when it comes to headless content delivery, AEM is built up of three foundational pillars. So we'll start off with the model editor. This is where an administrator or a power user uses the content fragment model editor to start defining the structure of our reusable content. Our business users, so our editors, can then use the content fragment editor to start creating content fragments, those reusable pieces of content, which are defined by those models. So AEM has a designated user interface to create and manage all of that reusable content at scale. So they can filter on type, localization, so which language the content is created in, who created or last modified the content fragment, etc. And then lastly, AEM can expose all of that content to our applications and channels using the GraphQL API. So here our developers will start creating queries for our API that will give their application exactly the fields of content that they need in order to render the experience. All right, so enough with the slides, and let's just look at the demo and do this ourselves. So here on my left, I have another screen with my AEM as a cloud service interface, my authoring interface on the left, and my application on the right. So for those of you who've ever been to one of these sessions that we run, I'm sure you're familiar with the Weekend brand. So the Weekend brand is a company that writes about adventures, going on different sort of adventures, but they also sell prepackaged adventures, and that's how they make money, right? And in this case, this application, I developed this in React. It's a single page application, but it could just as well have been a native mobile or a native desktop app, right? So let's just look at how to create those content fragment models. So I will go to my content fragment models. And here you can see that I can organize my models per brand. So this might be very useful if you have a multi-brand setup, that you can have separate content fragment models per brand. In this case, I'm going to my AEM demo brand. In this case, that's where the Weekend brand is connected to. And I'm going to open up an article content fragment model. And here you can see this is a very easy to use interface in order for me to create my content fragments. And note here that I do not need a developer to create my content fragment models. This is something that I, as a power user, can do. And just some things to note. So here we have our data types. And this really defines our content fragments, right? So we can have a title, a date, an identifier, a featured image. So we can also link in our content fragment specific fields that link to my digital asset management system, which in this case is also AEM, AEM assets in this case. But I can also link or nest other content fragment models inside my content fragment, creating pretty advanced setups here when it comes to content fragments. When it comes to governance, so if I click on one of these data types in my properties, I can add some additional governance features like validation, whether it's required or not, but also custom validation, right? So in this case, I added a custom regular expression that helps my authors enter the right piece of content in the way that my application needs to consume it. All right, so using this, let's create a new content fragment. So what I'll do is go to my content fragment admin panel. And here what I'll do is I'll create a new content. And since I am based in Stockholm, Sweden, why not build an article writing about visiting the Swedish capital? Oh, hold on. Do that again. And here I'm just selecting the location of my content fragment. So in this case, I want my content fragment to be under my magazine, and I've already created a folder here. Now I can select my content fragment model. In this case, I want it to be an article, and I can name my article the Swedish capital. I can spell correctly. All right, now I can open it from here. I can also get to that same content fragment model through my asset manager, which I'll do. And here you can see I set this up for the English language brand, but I could also set this up for multi-language, right? So in this case, I'll go into my magazines. And here you can see I've already prepared some additional assets that I can use in my content fragments. And here as an author, now I can start filling in those fields that I use the content fragment model editor to actually design this content fragment, right? So now I can exploring the capital. I can enter today's date, add a slug, in this case, exploring the capital. I'll also add a featured image. This is where I already prepared those images. I'll attach an author, in this case, Sophia Gerbij. And I can add some text here as well. So in this case, I'll just add some lorem ipsum text, but you can add whatever. And I'll also add an inline image for my article. And now I have a couple of different things that I can do. I can directly publish this content fragment, but I can also save it just on my author. So my preview application can view this, right? So now let's go back to my application. And now what should be happening if I open up my articles, you can now see that my exploring the capital content fragment that we just created is now showing up in the application. Now, how this works is if we look, and I'm just going to clear this, and my application is actually creating API calls to my AEM author instance, and I get JSON back that then my application will actually parse. So you can see here article title, a date, etc. So all of those fields that we defined in the content fragment model, they will be reflected in the API. All right, so one other thing to note is that here we can set up different endpoints as well. So let's say you have a multi-brand setup. So in this case, I am using my AEM demo assets endpoint to query for my articles. If you have a multi-brand setup, what you can do with AEM is create multiple API endpoints for your GraphQL, for your applications that are querying your GraphQL. So here you can see that I can very easily set up multiple endpoints, and this might be very useful if you have, as I said, a multi-brand setup. All right, so let's look at, from a developer perspective, how do I actually create those GraphQL queries that I can then implement in my application to actually get that content out of AEM. And AEM comes with this very handy graphical explorer, which basically allows us as a developer to start creating queries. So, and as you can see, this is all, I can get some hints as well. So I can really start to build my queries like this. Maybe I want path and some other things as well. So here I can create and test out my GraphQL queries. But another thing I can do, so while client-side GraphQL queries can be executed via a HTTP post command, those are really hard to cache. And that's why we also added a possibility to add persisted queries that actually can be cached by HTTP caches or a CDN because they are stored as an HTTP GET request. So in this case, what I can do as a developer, I can start creating those queries, I can save them and then publish them to my publish instance in order for my application to then consume those, in this case, articles. And you can see that those articles actually, those fields comply with what I entered in my content fragment model. Now, this is all strongly typed. So you saw that I got some hints when I was creating a GraphQL query, and that is because as soon as I create a content fragment model and I save it, AEM creates a GraphQL schema out of that. So, and this allows us to, basically it's a strongly typed article model that then the GraphQL can use. You can see that these fields actually comply with what I entered in my content fragment model. And then if I want to add a model, let's say I want to add variation to this, you can see that my variation, in this case master, now shows up in my GraphQL result. So even for a developer, it's pretty easy to start defining these API calls and using the Graphical Explorer. All right, so let's look at how this looks from an architectural perspective. So I mentioned that my application connects to my author environment, so that basically acts as a preview application. But obviously, we also need a production app. So here on my iPad, you can see the basic setup of how this works, right? So in this case, I have my preview application connecting directly to my AEM author. And my content author is creating content using the content fragment editor to create, in my demo's case, an article. So they use the AEM author interface to create the content. Now, as soon as they're ready and they use the preview application to see if everything is correct, they can then publish that content fragment to the AEM publish and dispatcher setup. So, and then my production application can use the persisted query get call via the GraphQL API to then get that content. If I can spell, I'll just do like this. GraphQL API. All right, so this is from a very simple architecture perspective, how you can, still use GraphQL APIs to preview content that your authors create, and then as soon as they're happy with the result, they can publish it. Then your production application uses the AEM publish GraphQL API to actually get that content out. All right, so some other resources that I want to leave you with is we have a public GitHub page where we, for instance, have an AEM Headless client for JavaScript, but also server-to-server Node.js, Java, etc. that helps you with querying and things like authorization for previewing on the author environment, etc. Besides that, and I'm sure to some of you who've been to these kind of sessions before, you've heard of Experience League. This is where you can find tutorials, but also starter code examples, like, for instance, how to build your headless application using React or Next.js or iOS, Android, etc. So this is a really good starting point for not just your editors and your business users, but also your developers on really getting started with AEM and Headless. All right, what else? Some closing remarks I'd like you to start thinking about when choosing a content delivery model, whether that's headless, traditional, or hybrid, is always to let your requirements drive the choice of your delivery model. That's also what Joshua kind of alluded to in the beginning. And headless might not always be the right choice for you, or it might, and that's great. And you have that flexibility with Adobe Experience Manager. So perhaps you have a few services or applications that need their content delivered headlessly via API, and others, perhaps like your website, should be delivered through traditional HTML. And this is really where the power of AEM comes in, because you can use AEM to deliver the same content to both of those channels, just in different formats. So one other thing to keep in mind is are your business users, so your content creators who need the solution to create your content. So I'd urge you to also keep their needs in mind. Create a good content structure that is manageable, set up for localization if you need it, set up for multi-brand if you need it, and really give them the tools they need to create content easily. And again, on Experience League, we have guides and best practices to help you get started on that. And lastly, we've seen today that AEM can do headless, but it can do a whole lot more. So today we've looked at delivery via GraphQL headlessly, but you can see in the diagram here that besides headless and traditional HTML, we also offer a hybrid model where editors have more editorial control by offering a headless delivery model, where my authors can actually edit a single page application in a what you see is what you get editing experience, just like traditional HTML, so dragging components on the page, etc. So at the end of the webinar, you'll see a QR code where you can leave your feedback. Let us know if that's something that you'd like me to talk more about next. All right, and with that, I'd like to thank you for your time today. Don't forget to leave your feedback on what you'd like to see next, and I'll hand it back to Joshua for some final words. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Timu. That was fantastic. Really appreciate that very robust demo to walk through for everybody. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware of some upcoming Tech Academy sessions. They're listed here. Platform query service, simplifying asset management with AEM assets, data collection with mobile SDK on iOS. So please register and join those as well. And then as Timu mentioned, here's the QR code. So you can scan and provide feedback to us. We would really appreciate so we can continue to grow this and continue to make sure that we're providing the right kind of content that's the most helpful for you as we plan out future sessions on these very interesting ideas around Adobe Experience Manager, content and headless and assets and everything in between. So thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate it, and we'd love to hear some feedback.